During the midst of COVID-19, I was a 9th grader in high school. My average day consisted of sitting in a large office chair at the desk my brother used before moving to college, and I would idly sit, do online homework, and wish I could be somewhere else. I would do a lot of wishing. I missed my friends and the loved ones whom it was too dangerous to see due to old age or immunodeficiencies. It was a lonely time, one which a majority of Americans and the greater population felt. The pandemic was a collective moment in our recent memory where the whole of society got a sense of how social isolation feels, how loneliness feels. Now, loneliness isn't simply the act of being alone. According to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, 2023, loneliness is the discomfort that comes from the perception of one's own social or emotional needs unmet. Page 7. In other words, it's an emotional state, a feeling. And in American culture, loneliness isn't often talked about openly. More often than not, it's a subject which is stigmatized. Yet, when looking at the data from both before and after the pandemic, it seems like this experience of loneliness is something pervasive, much more than a person would likely expect. As seen before the pandemic, in 2018, 46% of U.S. adults reported feeling alone, sometimes or always, as indicated in a study by the American Psychiatric Association, 2020, paragraph 3. Now, let's look at a study from a few years later, from a different source, just to see how loneliness levels out after the pandemic. In August of 2024, 41% of American adults said that they sometimes, rarely, or never got the social and emotional support they needed, according to census data compiled by the National Center for Health and Statistics, 2024. From this data, it's clear to see that loneliness isn't an experience contained to quarantines, but the state of many normal times, which is worrying, as the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, 2023, details that loneliness and social isolation increase the risk for premature death by 26% and 29% respectively. More broadly, lacking social connection can increase the risk for premature death as much as smoking up to 15 cigarettes a day. Page 8. Loneliness is nothing to be downplayed, as it poses a real risk to many. So then, that poses the question, what has and is propagating loneliness in American life? And is there anything that can be done? To answer this question, we need to first look at a bit of historical context and reflect on our culture. Then, look at structures which dictate how we interact with others. After that, we can discuss how it's possible to better our world and ourselves. Let's begin with the Industrial Revolution. In the late 1700s, as watermills began powering great machines, another change started to take place with this monumental movement of the industrial current: how communities were structured. According to author Faye Alberti, 2019, industrial society ruptured the existence of many small communities as families moved to urban centers. Curiously, around this same time was when depictions of loneliness, in its modern sense of a feeling, came into literature. Minute 6. The appearance of loneliness in this time is no coincidence. The restructuring of society led to people leaving their tight-knit, rural life for a world of competitive factory work, where life was lived to better the standing of one's immediate family, not necessarily a community. From this cultural change emerged the social theory of individualism. Merriam-Webster, the dictionary, ND, defines individualism as a theory maintaining the political and economic independence of the individual and stressing individual initiative, action, and interests. Paragraph 2. Basically, an individual is wholly responsible for themselves and should be able to better themselves as they like. In the context of expansionism and American exceptionalism, emphasizing personal freedom made sense. But in a lot of ways, it wasn't anything amazing. Along with other negatives we do not have time to go over, the rise of individualism influenced rates of loneliness for this reason. If the common ideology is that a person is fully responsible for themselves, then emotional states, like loneliness, are at the person's fault. Mark Travers, 2023, an American psychologist, states one who feels shame over a feeling, like loneliness, may develop a tendency to withdraw in fear of judgment, ultimately worsening loneliness as the person misses opportunities for connection. Paragraph 9. Framing loneliness as a personal fault hurts those who are feeling lonely, while also detracting from the reality that there are always structures and circumstances that influence our social environments. No one has full control of their environment, and so no one can be fully at fault for loneliness. But we do have control over the policy which creates our infrastructure, which is the next part of the puzzle of loneliness. The arrangement of our infrastructure determines the amenities any given person is able to access. One such amenity is places where one can meet others. Parks, pubs, libraries, you name it. And a lot of residential areas don't allow for a reasonable proximity to these amenities. According to urban planner Erik Karlsson, 2020, zoning, the act of dictating where buildings can be, has hurt urban form because of its tendency to separate uses. In many municipalities, single-family homes were separated from retail uses, office uses, and other commercial uses. Current zoning laws, which were put in place to protect people from things like overcrowding, now separate us from both other people and amenities which could better our lives. In a lot of cities, the places we would wish were nearby to meet others are legally restricted from being built near housing due to zoning laws. This may make you ask, why not just drive to these places? But that car-centric approach is actually a part of the problem. The reporter, Meyerson, 2023, describes how parking minimums, car-centric zoning laws which mandate a certain number of parking spaces for buildings, lead to sprawling urban spaces with large distances between buildings due to the needed off-road space designated for parking spots. Paragraph 3 through 8. This urban sprawl furthers the distance between residences, stores, and places of community, ultimately mandating the use of vehicles in order to bridge the gap. But dependence on these vehicles ultimately furthers the issue as potential community centers are hindered by codes which economically and physically push them further away from residential areas, where people are. To combat loneliness, outdated laws need to be replaced with laws which foster communities, not damper them. In order to ease the social hurt, there are many things necessary to do, but first and foremost, we need to identify the structures detracting from community building and social growth, and to make it known that changes need to occur. What I've spoken about today is just the tip of the iceberg, but it's an important first look into the issue, and I'd like to detail how we can move past the infrastructural and cultural barriers I've spoken about today. First, policy needs to be altered to better urban and residential environments for fostering community. For example, the sociologists Milbrandt and Park, 2023, describe how accessibility of safe, diverse, and inclusive modes of mobility and transportation, e.g., bike paths, public transit, shared paths, can reduce experiences of loneliness and social isolation in cities. Page 16. Reforming transit in cities and towns can allow for individuals to better meet one another, while also closing gaps and bringing community groups closer to residential areas, improving social outcomes in communities. Second, American individualism needs to be recontextualized in order to better reflect the realities of our past while admitting that asking for help is not a sign of weakness, but a quality of those before us. Zacharis, 2022, a political scientist, details how American individualism, as we know it today, is largely misrepresented, as our forefathers, no matter how rugged, did receive help from the government and their communities in cheap or free land as Americans moved westward. In other words, it's a myth to say that Americans didn't work together to make the country we know today, and so we shouldn't act as if asking for help is wrong or a personal fault. This is especially true when understanding the benefits of seeking out forms of reassurance and support. As described in a meta-analysis by Hickens et al., 2021, therapy serves to better the outcomes of those who are lonely as it confronts the biases an individual might hold against themselves while participating in an inherently social activity. Seeking out professional help is the first step for an individual who feels they aren't receiving the social care they deserve. And although there are barriers to connection in our society, and they need to be addressed, it's crucial we do not conflate those barriers as insurmountable. To better the world, we all need to be strong, resilient, and there for one another. as it's by coming together that loneliness gives way to community.